Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for the really kind introduction, Jelle, and also Roderick. Thanks for giving me this opportunity. So let me just start by thanking, the faculty and students of the Royal Timpro College. It's really an honor and a pleasure to be able to share some of my ideas, some of my new work. And I was thinking about, as Jelle also was mentioning, I've mainly been working on, of course, on Northeast India, but a lot of the things that I've been thinking about also sort of expands into the larger region of Eastern Himalayas. And I was planning to, or I'm gonna share some thoughts relating to a new project that I'm applying for together with my colleague and friend Dolly Kikon, and also her husband Sanya Barbara, so Dolly now, she's at Melbourne University, and Sanya is at TIS in Guwahati. And so this is a project that we've been sort of thinking and thinking a lot about last year, and then we recently submitted an application. And I think that the main idea with the project is to really insist on the centrality of food sovereignty. And I think this really speaks to our current crisis with the corona, and I think this has been really reminded about how vulnerable our globalized capitalist society is. And I think, again, I'm speaking from Sweden, where we sort of really been thinking about that we have this notion about, a logistic chain just in time. So there is no supplies, no stocks kept, so even hospitals, but also shops, everything should be, it's like when you need something, you just order it and it's supposed to arrive just in time. But as we see now, this doesn't happen. So just one virus and things are really out of sync. And we see, there is lack of, in the Swedish case, lack of medical supplies. We have been so I think again, the idea about so thinking about the suffering and death we see today. It's rather depressing in a way, and I think. Here, then, I hope to sort of bring a little bit of hope, perhaps, by thinking about bringing you along to think about plant and plant life. And this is something that I've sort of been moving in this direction most recently, or say the last 2 or 3 years. Normally we think about plants, or we don't think so much about plants, perhaps, particularly not if we are in the social sciences or in the humanities. Plants are just this green background of our lives. It's nothing that we bother too much about. We think about serious things about politics, economics, conflicts, this or that. But what I would like then to invite you today to think about plants more as more closely, and also take plants seriously, thinking perhaps that plants have something to teach us about how to live on Earth. And this is something, again, plants not only as critical for food for humans or for animals, but also have something in their own right to actually teach us. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this is a new work in a way, and I would like to stress this. There is something that I've sort of encourage you also in the Q&A afterwards, that please help me to think about this, because this is things also that a lot of other people have been working on. And again, it's a new thing, but I feel that it brings me back to a lot of the things that I've been thinking about in my, now I'm going over to I've been thinking about this is actually a photograph from Bhutan. But my point here is that thinking about plants brings me back to something that I've been concerned about in my earlier, particularly during my students' day, as an activist within the green movement. And it's also, the question about how to live responsibility on Earth. And I think this is a question that is coming up in a different way. And it's thrown at us today by this, the youth movement, Friday for Future. And this is a photograph by one of the leading persons, Greta Thunberg, who so really effectively mobilized and been sort of a mobilizer more globally for the climate movement. And what they are doing here, they are seeking to hold political leaders and decision makers around the world accountable. And here, you know, that is, I mean, they keep stressing that we should listen to scientists. You know, that there are plenty of evidence by UN Climate Change Panel and others saying that, you know, business as usual is no longer an option. Things have to change, and we need a swift shift to a low carbon society. So emissions have to be significantly reduced the coming years or few decades if we as a species, in a way, will survive and thrive on planet Earth. So I think, and again, this is a big debate about, you know, in the Anthropocene, you know, but I think still, you know, even if people in the global north, for people like myself, who are, you know, responsible with the type of lifestyle we have, who have been driving the emissions, I think there is consequences that are being felt everywhere. And I think solutions have to be worked out in a different way in each place. And here I think, you know, the starting point, for me, I mean, the starting point in food, what we eat, what we grow, this is really central. And I think, again, you know, I suppose, for you who live sort of in the Eastern Himalayas, I think this is nothing new, you know. It's like you can't trust sort of that the shop will bring you food. I mean, a lot of people are used to the idea that we have to keep stock, we have to think ahead, you know, we have to think, yeah, we have to think ahead. So it's nothing new, but I think we really, as I said in this project, think that the starting point is back to the basics in a way. And here again, as a person that's been working on indigenous peoples, I think it's, you know, it's not here the idea to romanticize traditional ecological knowledge, but I firmly believe that this is a place to start when we think about the specific situations in, you know, again, in the region of Eastern Himalayas. And when I speak about Eastern Himalayas, in this project that we're applying for, you know, it's northeast, the hills of northeast India, but it's also Chittagong hill tracts in Bangladesh. We think about Nepal, Burma, Bhutan, as sort of the main countries. And here, yeah, I mean, I was thinking perhaps that you could throw in questions along the way, but I think perhaps, as Roderick was saying, it's perhaps better to take with all these IT things, perhaps better to take this later on. So what I will do then is that, okay, this is, I don't know why I have, that's a slide from, okay. So what I will do then here is I will sort of walk you through 3 different things. So I will begin with thinking about, you know, the new scholarships within multi-species studies, which is a sort of a very interesting field that is emerging, where, you know, you have not only, I mean, you have plant studies or critical plant studies, but you also have a lot of, you know, animal studies, in different ways thinking about relationship between human and non-human species. And as I said, you know, plants have been something that I've been sort of thinking more deeply about recent times. And I think here again is something, you know, what is it that, as a, in my case, a social scientist, or if you're in the humanities, you know, what can we bring to the table in thinking about plants in this particular case? When, I mean, we have people in botany, biology, and plant sciences that have been sort of working on plants all along, you know. Is it something that, you know, when we then, as in the social scientists, start to think about plants, do we bring something new to the table? And I think this is, again, something I would like to come back to later on. Would we then, you know, when we go ahead and study plants, do we do it in a different way? And I think there is something, and I think this is also something that I find very interesting with you know, the present time of the Anthropocene. You know, it has sort of forced a lot of people to start new conversations across disciplines. So there is a lot of this interesting stuff coming out. And I think, again, this is something with the multi-species studies, comes from people that are crossing disciplinary borders or boundaries. So that will be the first. And then we will move on to the second thing, which is food sovereignty. And here is something, you know, this is a sort of a food sovereignty is, in a way, it's not a neutral term. It's actually a normative term, I think. It comes from a social movement. It comes from the indigenous and small farmers movement in Latin America. and then been traveling and sort of gone global in a way, where everybody's informed a lot of the politics today. And so it's both a field of activism and scholarship around this term of food sovereignty. So I will come back to that later on. And I think what we have as a sort of hypothesis in our project is that, I mean, if you think about the whole, then particularly in the Northeast Indian case, you know, a lot of the ethnic movements has all been about territory, you know, to establish or territorial sovereignty of a specific territory. And I think the question about, and what we are thinking is that now it's a new time to start think about, you know, the inner workings of sovereignty. And I think here, I just read, I can't remember who said that, but it was an indigenous scholar who said, you know, how can we be sovereign if we don't have our own food, if we don't grow our own food? And I think that is something to that, you know, that getting a territory is important, and I think that project will still go on. But at some point, you have to start think about, you know, what do we do with that sovereignty? You know, can you be sovereign without having that basis of, you know, actually being able to grow your own food? And so this is something that I think, again, is and it's coming back in a lot of parts of the world, the same issue. You know, a lot of indigenous organizations are bringing that, so it's coming up. And I think this is something I also would like to sort of think about, because a lot of, even if you think about the multi-species studies, you know, why is it that so many scholars at this point of time are, you know, moving in that direction, thinking about the relations between different species, not only thinking about humans, but how we relate and how we become with others. And also in terms of food sovereignty, I see that in a lot of indigenous groups around the world turning to the concern about food sovereignty. And why is that at this particular point of time becoming an important thing? And here again, you know, food sovereignty, I know that there's a lot of initiatives in Bhutan in relation to this, you know, to bring back plants, but also in terms of, you know, indigenous cuisines. And so I think this is very interesting. And this is something I really hope eventually, if you get this project, I would, and hope to be able to visit Bhutan and learn more about this. I have actually I've been able to spend 1 month in Bhutan, and this was sort of a 1 month consultancy I did. I was looking at e-governance, something really different than what I do otherwise. But it was actually a chance for me to visit Bhutan, and I had a month of traveling around the country, and it was one of my, you know, really most lovely journeys I've done. It was such a beautiful place and so interesting. And I was traveling with anthropologist Kunsang Dorji, who is sort of really a most remarkable man. It seems to be, you know, that he knew every corner of every village in Bhutan, you know, he knew it. So if any one of you know Kunsang, I would, you know, really like to send my warmest regards to him. So food sovereignty in a way comes back to the heritage plants, and I will just bring you some of these thinking about heritage plant, and then, you know, just end by a small example of growing millet in Nagaland. And I think actually, if we go back to that, the image that I had from which I took when I was in Bhutan, can't remember which place. But now when I look at it, I wasn't sure what is the plant, because again, you know, I'm not a plant expert, I'm learning here. But I think actually this is millet, isn't it? we can perhaps come back to that. But I was thinking myself, what is this? Is it, first I thought it can be corn, but I do believe it actually is millet. And somehow I find that millet is a very interesting plant to think about. Okay, so that's sort of the organization of the talk. So let me then, you know, throw you okay, yeah. So as I said, you know, multi-species studies is an emerging field within the social sciences and humanities during the last decade or so, and it stresses how humans have lived intimately with other creatures, be they animals, plants, microbes, insects, and so on. So humans have never been alone. You know, we have always, you know, our history is always on co-becoming with others. And we need to pay attention to these relations to others in order to survive and thrive in the Anthropocene. So human dominance and extractivist mood that characterize industrial capitalism have proven to be one of the that leads really to death and destructions. And again, of course, we've been able to improve lives, and particularly in the global north, but of course also globally, that people have, the material standards have increased. But as we also all know, that is, the goodies of this industrial capitalist development has really sort of been very unequally distributed. So we have, the concentration of wealth is extremely unequal, and a lot of people around the world face difficulties getting, the basics of, clean air, drinking water, and enough food to eat. And we also know that which also been one of these alarm reports that we hear about life in the Anthropocene, that 1 million species are, on the risk of being extinct. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is the expansion of, monoculture plantations. As well as expansion of cities, different types of infrastructure projects that sort of expand into various forms of sort of areas, marshlands, savannas, forest areas, places where you used to have sort of refuge for animals and plants. So these are things that I think a lot of us are aware of, and of course it's something that is extremely depressing. And I think here, those of you who have sort of perhaps had a chance to look at something that I've been working on or written but before, Jelle was mentioning this book, The Unruly Hills. And I think my earlier work has sort of mainly been within the framework of political ecology. And I think a lot of the political ecology studies, in a way, is a sort of a framework where you map to different actors who try to control and appropriate resources, land and resources. So I've been looking at forest issues, mining issues, and other, and also, the building of dams, and particularly then in the case of Northeast India. And I think by now we have a sort of a fairly good understanding of a lot of these works in the region of Eastern Himalayas. Here usually we see, how outside contractors, together with state bureaucracy, sometimes a corrupt state bureaucracy, and sort of the indigenous elite, if you're talking about some of the hill areas, how these collaborate to extract resources. And often in extraction, they are completely oblivious to, the environmental damage that it causes, as well as if you think about, for example, coal mining, which is one of the main things, of course, now supposedly stopped in the Meghalaya case, but, completely oblivious to the suffering of the laborers. Sometimes small kids, forced to dig out coal, by hand in these rat holes. So it's a very cruel form of capitalism, primitive capitalism in a way, that's been sort of, and I think we have a fairly good understanding how this works. But yet, of course, this is something that, so I think that project still, it's still a very relevant approach to think about, the politics of nature and survival in contemporary times. I think, for example, I was just reading, this very troubling thing, that was in the news, like 250,000 trees are to be cut down in Arunachal Pradesh in order to pave way for the building of new dams. So when you see stuff like this, of course, you have to then think about these critical questions about, in whose interest is this? Who is winning? Who will benefit and who will, lose? Will be the loser if this is happening. And again, think about questions about, hydropower projects that used to be, if you think about the larger debate in the 90s about big dams, it was the most, the environmental movements all around the world was criticizing, the building of dams. And suddenly now we have a situation where hydropower is supposedly the new green. So I think things about that, these critical questions need to be raised. But yet in my own case, then I've been start moving in relationship to this, as I said, multi-species studies. and thinking about particularly the relatedness between humans and non-humans, and the sort of pay attention to these histories of entangled life, the practices of codependence and relatedness of people and non-human life that constitute what we often refer to as nature. And again, you know, the thing about new, it is partly new, but of course we have a lot of, in anthropology, we have a lot of work by people who've been, you know, thinking about how humans depend on cows and, you know, how you make a living in harsh environments, you know, so a lot of work on subsistence strategies. So these are that, but I think something new still are happening in the sense of trying to not only think about, you know, how we eat plants and animals, you know, and how we make use of them, but also try to sort of cross over and think about the life world of these non-human beings, how they perceive the world, you know, and thinking in terms of, you know, the type of life project that are emerging within this, and also, you know, the idea about agency, you know, thinking about agency of plants and animals and insects and stuff like that. So these are, in a way, it's questions are raised in a new way, and here I think, you know, yeah, again, the idea that we can actually learn something from animals, plants, and insects, you know, whose life we so intimately depend on. And I think this was a wake-up call, you know, suddenly with the massive death of insects in Europe because of pesticides used in agriculture. And suddenly there was no bees around, and, you know, no pollinating insects. You know, the crisis of the agriculture system then. And I think here again, I'm thinking about, you know, the work by Donna Haraway, who insists on that we become with others or not at all. I mean, so again, the idea, and this is an argument she's pursuing in her new book, or it's not so new now, Staying with the Trouble. And in this book, again, you know, stressing on that we need to understand this relatedness, you know, work with these relations with others. And I think if you're interested in this type of work, you know, I think a good starting point is this journal that you see down in the corner there, the journal Environmental Humanities, where you have a lot of interesting work in this particular field. Another one I have in the middle there, it's one of my favorites, actually, The Mushroom at the End of the World by anthropologist Anna Tsing. I think it's a lovely, and then there are issues that one can talk about, but I think, again, it's a very interesting book where you start think about the workings of capitalism in a way, but you look at from the perspective, the mushroom, the Matsutake mushroom is in center. You know, there is humans, there is pine trees, but the mushroom is somehow the key actor or the key protagonist in the story, which I find very interesting. And I think another, and this is also the book by Tom Van Doren about extinction. I mean, he's one of the sort of leading studies in extinction studies, but also he's working on birds. In the field of plants, one of my favorites is the work by Natasha Myers. And she's urging us, you know, she's been coining this term about planthropology, and also she's been coining the notion of planthropocene. But, you know, she said we have to start look at plants, and we have to get to know plants intimately and on their own terms. So again, she suggests this, you know, new planthropology, aiming to document the effective ecologies taking shape between plants and people. And I mean, this is, she's also, it's quite interesting because in the multi-species studies, there is also a lot of artist works also coming out, you know, artistic research and people. And I think Natasha Meyer, she's a photographer, but also a dancer. And she's been doing some, you know, experimental photography, trying to capture the movement of plants and trees, and of trees in her case. And I think that's pretty interesting. So I mean, so you have in the multi-species, you have all this literature, and I think some of this can be a really important source of inspiration. But I would still like to sort of stress, I mean, now speaking sort of older person to students then, but I mean, I would really stress that it's more important in a way to go out in communities and learn from people that are living on the land and sort of whose existence depends on, you know, being able to read nature and, you know, cultivate things so looking at these practices of people out there is also another way of getting into how that relatedness is played out in a concrete way. And here again, I'm sort of would like to urge you, I mean, I don't know, yeah, we can come back to that, you know, but the scope for doing field work, you know, if you study anthropology and I think that really, you know, you need to spend long time out in the field, studying and learning with people. Yes, doing, you know, this snapshot, you know, you rush out, you take the bus out and you do some fire away, you do some short-term interviews and census. I mean, that can be useful at some times, but I really would like to sort of urge you to try to work out that you really have time in the field, do proper long-term field work. And I was just, I mean, and I was just seeing that, and this is again, you know, so that some of your students were part of this workshop that Dan Smeyer-Ju was organizing in Yunnan recently. And again, so some of these ideas about multi-species studies, you know, and again, insisting on long-term field work is not new for you, I suppose. This is, I really think that this is something that also Jan has been talking about in anthropology. And again, I'm thinking here, you know, that I also know Dan, and I've been thinking about, you know, that is a lot of, I think I mentioned this earlier, but there is something here that, why is it that so many people seem to be moving in the same direction at this point of time? You know, so that this explosion of social sciences, people in the social science and humanities who suddenly are interested in this, you know, plant people, animal people, insect people, you know, this relatedness between these. And I think this is something to really consider, you know. I mean, of course, in anthropology, we are really sort of trend sensitive people. We try to always do the new things, but I think there is something more to it. And I think there is some kind of awareness that we need to go back and build on these basic relations. That's at least my reading of it. And I think there is also something, you know, this about, as I said, about this type of indigenous knowledge. And someone was just bringing attention to this book by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she's a sort of a plant scientist and an indigenous member of the Potawatomi Nation in North America. And as she put it, her elders used to say that plants have been around much longer than humans, and that we need to learn to listen to them. And this is a quote, and plants know how to make food and medicine from light and water, and then give it away. And it's something really humbling about this, which I find, you know, so interesting. And I think in this again, you know, is I really like this book, because here she's trying to, I mean, she's a person that been trained as a plant scientist, and then how she sort of left her community and then came back, and how she tried to bring this to in conversation, you know, her sort of indigenous knowledge type of things, and, you know, the stories by her elders, in relation and in dialogue with her scientific understanding, her scholarship. So she says, as I said, you know, in her younger period when she was doing a PhD and stuff like that, she was somehow dismissing her other way of knowing. But now she's trying to sort of bring this in conversation. And I think this is something I find also happening in a lot of different places in the world. So okay, so nature gives away, you know, the plants give away themselves as food. I think there's something, you know, offering here that is interesting. And this also brings us over to the second theme, which is, you know, food sovereignty. And this is a photograph from a meeting by the La Via Campesina movement. And as I said, you know, the term food sovereignty emerged in the context of Latin American small farmers and indigenous peasants struggling against neoliberalization of food and agriculture policy, with the state giving up earlier support to the small-scale farm sector and opening up for imports and the takeover by transnational agro-industries in the 90s. And this grew sort of starting sort of in Latin America, it grew into the Via Campesina movement, grew into sort of a transnational movement, you know, again, you know, bringing this notion of food sovereignty, making it sort of a more popular and well-known one. And sort of, again, you know, being a movement in defense of indigenous agroecological practices. And here again, I think it's something, there are quite vast, you see there's quite a lot of literature on food sovereignty. And I think my reading here is that it's quite sort of still a quite dynamic concept. It's not fixed to a fixed set of principles, but but yet it's tied to some kind of, the dual goals of environmental stewardship and livelihood security. So in short, one can say it's about sustainable agriculture, where agriculture is more than just business, but concerns a way of life. So here it's questions about control over land, control over plant material, about seed sovereignty. It's about access to credit, and knowledge is central. And that is sort of a general distrust and critique against the global industrial model of agriculture, the massive use of pesticides and fertilizer, and also the increased circulation of genetically modified plants. So production, if you follow this way of thinking, production should be local for local use, and hence avoid long distance transport, which, as we know, lead to more green gas emissions. So I think there are a lot of debate here. I think some part of this movement is not that you should be no export, that, and also that I think a more sort of perhaps, but we can come back to that later on. But I think there are sections in the movement that saying that of course we have to also produce for the market. But still, I would say that the general claim of the Via Campesino movement is that that traditional peasant agriculture is more energy efficient and hence have a smaller ecological footprint than modern industrial agriculture. The traditional form of agriculture is also valued for its high biodiversity, this idea about agro-biodiversity. Using a large number, as we know, people are using a lot of different crops, and again, crops that's been attuned to local conditions in that particular place. So these plants then they are appreciated for being more resilient to changes in the weather because again, they've been accustomed to that particular place. So when you have, as we see now, more and more coming in the climate change, there's more extreme weather events, longer periods of drought, and combined with extreme, heavy downfall, storms with heavy downfall of rain. So these, traditional plants, it seems to be more resilient to these type of events. But it's also interesting here, paradoxically in a way, and I think this is also both a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing, that now there is a lot of, from the agro industries, there's a lot of interest in these indigenous heritage plants because, some of these indigenous agriculture areas are considered to be sort of a reservoir, a living reservoir, an archive of seeds, So there is a genetic material here that is interesting for some of these plant breeding ventures that that from the agro industries. So this is also something to, so there are an appreciation of that agro biodiversity, but of course there is always, as always, people that also would like to cash in on that. Sorry. So here, one of the things that I also been very interested in this idea about seed sovereignty, and this is an image that I actually taken from some of the work that Vandana Shiva has been involved. She's been involved in protest against the seed monopoly by these large agro industries, and trying to encourage farmers to keep their own seed storage. And I think this is extremely important because if you control the seed, you control the food production. And this is something that I also been involved in. I've been working on a monograph or sort of an edited volume that is coming out soon, where we called Seed Waste, the controls. Someone said something. Plants in a warming world. So this book will be out next year. I'm having a quote here from the introduction of the book. Human history is fundamentally a multi-species story, and seeds thus function as a lens to trace relations and interdependencies between humans and plants. Through seed, one can explore the cultural and sensorial or affective connections between people, plants, and places. Seeds are often used as metaphors or tropes of possibilities, hope, and aspirations that are inherent yet not fully realized in the present. Engaging with seeds also brings us to critical political questions about control over the material basis of our existence, that is the main food crops. So yeah, so I think this is, I mean, and seeds are, you know, I don't know if I bring here, my chapter in the book deals with this particular seed. I don't know if anyone can recognize what kind of seed it is. Usually cut like this in two. This is actually tea seeds that I've been collecting in Kenya, in Africa, in Eastern Africa. And in my chapter, then I followed the story of tea from, you know, the British discovery that the Sinkpus was using tea. So the discovery in 1834 or exactly, I think was. So the discovery of that tea was growing wild in the forest, but it was actually planted by the Sinkpus in the forest, and how it was then taken from the forest into the plantation, you know, and in the plantation you remove all the vegetation, and then you bring this new, of course, so you bring the plant, and also you bring laborers under very, as we know, you know, under very horrible conditions to this place to work the plantation. But then I've been so I'm following down the tea plant from the forest into the plantation, but also from the plantations in Assam, you know, British settlers brought with them seeds and plant material to Eastern Africa and also to other places. And now, you know, tea based on the Assam tea variety is one of the Kenya's largest industries. Roughly 4 million people are living on tea. And here it's interesting because, of course, it was the large corporate sector before, but now it's more than I think almost 60% of the tea production is by small scale farmers who then sell the tea leaves. They can sell to corporate, but they also sell to sort of a state-run cooperative factories who process and sell the tea. So I'm sort of trying to think about a plant, and I think here, you know, I think my point here is in a way that sort of implicit here is that, you know, or not implicit, right, but I'm not pushing it so far, but I'm seeing now with climate change that the way to, you know, cultivate tea is to go back to the simple way, you know, where you follow, you know, you follow sort of, you imitate nature in a way and plant a tea crop, allow it to be a tree in the forest rather than taking it out of or trying to take it out of the forest and have it sort of in a sterile environment. So anyway, that is something that I think I speak too much now. Okay, but another 10 minutes. Is that okay, Roderick? Okay, I take that as a yes. Okay, so we are moving into, so someone said something, or?
No, please go ahead. Take the 10 minutes.
I take another 10 minutes then.
Yeah.
Sure. So as I said, you know, that I've been then thinking about the tea plant, which in a way is also a sort of an indigenous plant then when we think about Eastern and Himalayan, going all the way, you know, Southeast Asia, but also Yunnan and I think this is interesting, and I think, you know, I've really been thinking about how that, as I said, you know, how can we think about another way of cultivating tea outside and still having some kind of volumes, but not using the plantation. And this is actually existing because, I mean, the Sinkpus are not in Northeast are not planting in the forest anymore tea, but in Thailand and Yunnan we do have this forest grown tea, which I'm also very curious about. But that's a little bit a side project of mine. So now coming back to sort of, again, you know, the application that we just recently submitted, where focus is on heritage plants. And as I said, you know, or as Jelle was mentioning, that Dolly and I had just finished this project about indigenous youth, you know, leaving the hill areas to work in the sort of in the service industry in the big cities. I mean, a lot of them go for study, you know, in Bangalore, Hyderabad, Mumbai, Pune, and of course Delhi. And because of that, and this is a book that just came out last year with Cambridge, and here it's, I mean, a lot of them do manage to get quite reasonably well-paid job in the service industry because they have a certain, you know, culture, sensibility, and also, you know, language, English, but also as Jelle and together with Professor Tankasuba has been pointing to, the sort of the face, they look different, they don't look Indian. I think that has been an asset working in the service industry. They appear as, our friend Duncan McDougall has pointed to the Asia coolness in a way. They are sort of Asian, but not really Indian, and that gives a sort of a flavor of newness and cosmopolitanism to these, restaurants and spas that a lot of these youth are working. But I think what we've seen in this book, what we've seen and what is actually been even more now with the corona is that they are exposed to a lot of racist attacks. Particularly women are, there are all kinds of sexual assaults, slurs thrown at them. And now with the corona thing about, being Chinese, they're assumed to be Chinese, and they're being spreading the virus. And so it's a very, very vulnerable life they are living. And one of the sad things that we really felt, that in the interviews and hanging out with these young migrants is that a lot of them said that they were constantly moving on in a way, looking for something. But a lot of them said, that there is no going back in a way. There is because, they didn't want to work in agriculture. That was sort of one of the basic messages. The young people looking for something else. And they said that, I can't go back to my village because I don't want to work in agriculture and there's nothing there for me. So they were somehow chasing on. And I think this was in a way very sad because a lot of them were still invested in what was happening back home. A lot of them had a very strong, sense of, the ethnic, the particular group they belonged to. There was a very strong sense and they wanted to sort of support the movement for rights of that particular group. But also in terms of, the food they were eating, and they were hanging out, with student groups from that particular ethnic group. And so it was very, very strong sense of belonging. But again, this idea of not really being able to go back. And here, I think in the book, it's a very nice, we have a concluding afterword by Duncan McDougall, where he is suggesting that perhaps the coming 10 years, the decade will be that of returns. I think this is something that, also Dole and I have been thinking about, what is it then, both returning, but also those staying back, how can you live on the land? And I think that's why we've been thinking about, and also because a lot of these young migrants, they were so obsessed with the indigenous cuisine, eating the stuff from home, and sort of being part of the home through, eating the crops and plants from home. So we've really been thinking about, so if you think in terms of, possible returns, can these youth bring something new to, and, find other ways of living on the land, perhaps, combining old, the growing of old heritage crops with, new ways of developing the cuisine, the food stuff. This is something that sort of been sort of obsessed with in a way. And again, because of this increased vulnerability that we see through the corona crisis, perhaps some of these migrants think, okay, I have to somehow go back and try to make a new living and live on the land. So here again, in this context, the idea about food sovereignty becomes so crucial and critical to think about. Also, in terms of developing the sort of the indigenous cuisine, as I said. And here, then, in the project, thinking about food sovereignty not only in the context of Northeast, but also extending this to the larger Eastern Himalayan region. And I think it's interesting to look at here that is several international organizations, IFAD, ICIMOD, who have been sort of stressing this idea about food sovereignty and also, bringing back all types of, heritage plants. They've been sort of pursuing that as trying to support communities in some building food security and sustainable agricultural development. And so there is a lot of things going on, and partly of that comes from, as I said, international development agencies, also by different nation states, but also from the NGO sectors. So trying to look at, first the idea is to see what is going on. What are these different actors doing involved in supporting this type of, sustainable agriculture in different ways. And when we were working with this project, we ran with this application. We ran into this. You can't see the full. I can't see in my screen anyway the full title of this. But we were running into these beautiful articles, small article in the Guardian, talking about how the women's organization Northeastern Network, how they managed to, together with villages in Nagaland, to revive the cultivation of millet, a traditional crop with high nutritious value, as well as that it can be easily sort of cultivated without irrigation, and also it seems to be very suitable for more unreliable climatic conditions. So in this article, it speaks about Bulu Tur, an old woman in the New Poor village, who this is her, she's a stones believer in millet, and she's telling the reporter that there's an old saying in the community that even a single stalk of millet can revive a dying man. And Miss Tur, she's been one of a few in the village that has actually held on to the cultivation of millet when others have gone over to other more modern plants, crops. And now, the knowledge she has of growing and saving seeds, become essential for the revival of the millet cultivation. And now NAN apparently have a network of 200 millet farmers in the village, in the district of Pek. And as one of the director of NAN explains, millet needs very little water, grows well on poor soil, is fast growing and suffers from very few diseases. Once harvested, it stores well for years. We see growing millet as a tool to empower local women farmers in the face of climate change. And then is trying to different, through farmers festivals, food festivals, different other events to bring both, the crop, but also various food items, to sort of popularize the use of millet. And I think, one should always take reports by different NGOs with a pinch of salt, because this is, they have to get money for what they're doing, so they have to sell sort of success stories, and we all look for success stories. But I think there is something here that I think is more than just a success story. I do think that what is happening here, these women planting here, they are really planting hope. And this is something that I would really, both as a scholar, but also activist, I have a sort of still a small activist part in me, support this type of initiatives. So I think this is where I would like to stop and open up for